Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. There is a kind of silence that isn't peace, a silence carved by fear, a silence manufactured by power. And for centuries in the cotton fields of the American South, that silence was deafening. The overseers, the plantation lords, the entire system thrived on it. You were not supposed to know what happened beneath the burning sun, between the rows of white gold. You were only supposed to know the prophets, the empire, the myth of southern gentility. But if you peel back that curtain, if you dare to descend into the machinery that kept it running, you will find something darker than you imagined. Devices, punishments, rituals of control so cruel they read like nightmares pulled straight from the underworld. Imagine the sound. A pistol cracks at 4 in the morning. That's not the start of a workday. It's a gunshot alarm clock designed to burn terror into the minds of the enslaved. Before the first hint of sunrise touches the fields, broken bodies rise, stumbling toward their endless battle with thorned cotton. Every step isn't just labor, it's submission forced through exhaustion. But what kept them there was not just the work, not just the heat, not even the hunger. It was the calculated mechanical cruelty that waited if their pace faltered. Torture was not chaos. It was system. It was policy. It was the science of domination. Let me tell you what the textbooks won't. The plantations were not simply farms. They were laboratories of psychological control. Every whip crack, every iron collar, every starvation ration was a variable in an experiment. The experiment? To see how far the human spirit could be bent before it snapped. Overseers weren't just sadists. They were engineers of terror, testing the boundaries of pain, inventing new devices, calculating punishments with cold precision. You've heard of medieval torture, iron maidens, racks and gallows. But what happened in the cotton fields was not relic or myth. It was industrialized cruelty, hidden under the mask of agriculture, protected by law, sanctified by religion, and forgotten by the wealth it created. Think of the iron collar, a band of metal locked around the neck, lined with spikes pointing inward, cutting deeper with every movement. Or the whipping machine, a grotesque contraption of pulleys and gears that turned a beating into a measured process, lash after lash delivered with mechanical consistency. These weren't punishments born of passion. They were punishments born of design, crafted to maximize fear while keeping the enslaved alive just long enough to keep producing wealth. This wasn't discipline. This was optimization of suffering. Understand this. The cotton plantation was an economy built not just on labor, but on fear itself. Every drop of blood spilled into the soil, every scream swallowed into the night was converted into profit. Mississippi Delta millionaires didn't simply trade cotton. They traded in human pain, weaponized through devices you've never been shown. Whips soaked in salt water to keep wounds raw. Ear cropping as permanent mutilation for those who dared escape. Branding irons pressed into flesh like cattle. Marks of ownership designed to last a lifetime. And all of it was dressed in the language of civility. Overseers wrote ledgers of lash counts, correlating missed cotton quotas with exact numbers of strokes. Punishment wasn't an accident. It was accounted, cataloged, justified. The lash became a form of bookkeeping, the iron collar, a ledger of obedience, the whip machine, an early technology of terror. This is why you were never supposed to know, because once you see the mechanics behind the suffering, you understand. This was not just cruelty, it was a system of power, and it still echoes in the systems you live under today. When men in suits talk about productivity, when institutions demand quotas, when discipline is measured in numbers instead of human lives, you are hearing an echo of that same plantation logic. The tools have changed, but the blueprint remains. Most men look at history as something buried, something that cannot touch them. But if you've ever felt the weight of a system grinding you down, if you've ever wondered why certain truths are hidden, then you've already felt the shadow of these fields on your own back. What was done there was not just about crops. It was about testing how deep control can go, control of body, mind, and spirit. And once you see that, once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you cannot unhear it. So I will ask you, do you want to keep going? Do you want to know what devices were used, what punishments were devised, how the overseers of cotton fields engineered suffering to break men into silence? If you continue down this path, there is no way back to ignorance. You will see not only what they endured, but what power is capable of when it is left unchecked. You have chosen to stay. That means the veil is lifting. But understand, what we're walking into now is not history as you were taught it. It is the hidden architecture of fear. If Section 1 was the door opening, Section 2 is the first step down into the chamber where cruelty became system, where pain was transformed into policy. Picture the whip. Not the crude strip of leather you imagine from a movie, but a weapon engineered for control. Overseers favored the cat-o'-nine tails, 9 braided strands, sometimes knotted with metal or bone, each lash tearing flesh into ribbons. One strike was not just pain, it was a message, but the genius of the system was not in the whip itself. It was in the mathematics of punishment. Overseers kept ledgers, pages that coldly recorded 2 lashes for every pound under quota. Do the math. If a man missed 20 pounds of cotton, that meant 40 lashes, each one designed to reduce him to a trembling lesson for everyone watching. This was not about cotton anymore. It was about fear spreading like wildfire across the field. And then there were devices, the iron collars, spiked from within, forcing the wearer to live in agony for days, weeks, sometimes months. Bells were attached to some, so every movement echoed shame through the quarters. Imagine trying to sleep, your head pressed against rough wood, each small shift carving metal into your flesh, each sound marking you as broken. This was not discipline, it was spectacle, a theater of domination staged for the benefit of other enslaved workers. Everyone saw, everyone learned, everyone obeyed. But the cruelty had a strange kind of logic. The goal was never to kill, at least not directly. A dead worker brought no profit. The plantation needed bodies alive, breathing, capable of producing, so the punishments were calculated to push men and women to the edge of destruction, but not over it. Permanent scars, permanent disfigurement, permanent terror. And in this cold efficiency lies the truth. Plantations were not farms, they were factories of suffering, extracting wealth through a kind of industrialized agony. Take branding. A runaway once captured was burned with a hot iron, often with the initials of the plantation owner seared into their skin. The scar became both punishment and advertisement. This flesh is owned, this rebellion was crushed. At Belmont Plantation, James Hammond used an H brand, a symbol that reduced human beings to livestock. Archaeologists have found these scars mentioned in runaway ads from Texas to Tennessee. Imagine that. An empire of ownership, its marks etched into human skin, passed from master to master like property deeds written in flesh. And if you think this was medieval, let me strip away that illusion. Medieval cruelty was often random. It was a system of power, and it still echoes in the systems you live under today. When men in suits talk about productivity, when institutions demand quotas, when discipline is measured in numbers instead of human lives, you are hearing an echo of that same plantation logic. The tools have changed, but the blueprint remains. Most men look at history as something buried, something that cannot touch them. But if you've ever felt the weight of a system grinding you down, if you've ever wondered why certain truths are hidden, then you've already felt the shadow of these fields on your own back. What was done there was not just about crops. It was about testing how deep control can go, control of body, mind, and spirit. And once you see that, once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you cannot unhear it. So I will ask you, do you want to keep going? Do you want to know what devices were used, what punishments were devised, how the overseers of cotton fields engineered suffering to break men into silence? If you continue down this path, there is no way back to ignorance. You will see not only what they endured, but what power is capable of when it is left unchecked. You have chosen to stay. That means the veil is lifting. But understand, what we're walking into now is not history as you were taught it. It is the hidden architecture of fear. If Section 1 was the door opening, Section 2 is the first step down into the chamber where cruelty became system, where pain was transformed into policy. Picture the whip. Not the crude strip of leather you imagine from a movie, but a weapon engineered for control. Overseers favored the cat-o'-nine tails, 9 braided strands, sometimes knotted with metal or bone, each lash tearing flesh into ribbons. One strike was not just pain, it was a message. But the genius of the system was not in the whip itself. It was in the mathematics of punishment. Overseers kept ledgers, pages that coldly recorded 2 lashes for every pound under quota. Do the math. If a man missed 20 pounds of cotton, That meant 40 lashes, each one designed to reduce him to a trembling lesson for everyone watching. This was not about cotton anymore. It was about fear spreading like wildfire across the field. And then there were devices, the iron collars, spiked from within, forcing the wearer to live in agony for days, weeks, sometimes months. Bells were attached to some, so every movement echoed shame through the quarters. Imagine trying to sleep, your head pressed against rough wood, each small shift carving metal into your flesh, each sound marking you as broken. This was not discipline, it was spectacle, a theater of domination staged for the benefit of other enslaved workers. Everyone saw, everyone learned, everyone obeyed. But the cruelty had a strange kind of logic. The goal was never to kill, at least not directly. A dead worker brought no profit. The plantation needed bodies alive, breathing, capable of producing, so the punishments were calculated to push men and women to the edge of destruction. But not over it. Permanent scars, permanent disfigurement, permanent terror. And in this cold efficiency lies the truth. Plantations were not farms. They were factories of suffering, extracting wealth through a kind of industrialized agony. Take branding. A runaway once captured was burned with a hot iron, often with the initials of the plantation owner seared into their skin. The scar became both punishment and advertisement. This flesh is owned. This rebellion was crushed. At Belmont Plantation, James Hammond used an H brand, a symbol that reduced human beings to livestock. Archaeologists have found these scars mentioned in runaway ads from Texas to Tennessee. Imagine that. An empire of ownership, its marks etched into human skin, passed from master to master like property deeds written in flesh. And if you think this was medieval, let me strip away that illusion. Medieval cruelty was often random, driven by rage or superstition. What happened in the cotton fields was different. It was scientific, experimental. Overseers tested devices, refined techniques, created systems. One plantation in Tennessee developed a whipping machine, a mechanical contraption of pulleys and weights that delivered lashes with consistent force. Think about that. A machine built not to produce goods, but to produce pain. An innovation of cruelty. But even more chilling was the psychology. Overseers often forced the enslaved themselves to participate in punishment, counting the lashes as they fell, holding down their own kin while the whip bit into their backs. Imagine the fracture in the soul, being turned into an accomplice to another's suffering. This was control at its deepest level, breaking bonds, weaponizing community against itself. No chains could bind tighter than the guilt and terror sewn into those moments. Every detail was weaponized. Even water became a tool of torment. Overseers would pour fresh water into the dirt, letting it soak into the soil while thirsty men and women watched, parched under a merciless sun. Water barrels were spaced deliberately far apart, forcing long walks under heat that often killed. Food rations were calculated with similar cruelty, just enough to keep bodies moving, never enough to keep them whole. Malnutrition was not neglect. It was policy. It was the science of breaking a body slowly, invisibly, inevitably. And in the shadows of all this, there was the spectacle of execution, not quick, not merciful. Public, deliberate, ceremonial. Workers were forced to gather, to watch one of their own hanged, mutilated, or torn by dogs. Sunday mornings, sometimes before church, the overseer making sure the sermon of obedience was delivered not from the pulpit, but from the gallows. This was not justice. It was theater, and the audience was always captive. Now you begin to see, this was not random cruelty. This was an ecosystem of pain. The plantation was a closed world where everything, hunger, thirst, labor, rest, punishment, reward, was designed to reinforce domination. Pain was not an accident of the system. Pain was the system. And here's the part that should disturb you most. Systems like these do not vanish. They evolve. What was once done with iron collars and whips is now done with policies, surveillance, quotas, psychological levers hidden behind the face of authority. The plantation was the prototype. You live inside its descendants. By now, you've seen the outlines of the system. Punishment as policy, cruelty as calculation. But to truly understand the descent, you must look directly at the devices, the instruments that turned human flesh into a battlefield. These were not relics from some barbaric past. They were engineered for one purpose only, to break the human spirit while keeping the body productive. And once you hear what they built, you will understand how far power will go when it decides that human beings are tools. The iron collar was among the most feared. At first glance, it was a simple band of forged metal locked around the neck, but overseers added inward-facing spikes that pierced the skin with every breath, every shift of the head. Some variants were fitted with long, curved prongs extending outward, preventing the wearer from lying down, from passing through doorways, from hiding in the shadows. Others had bells attached, ringing with every movement, announcing the victim's presence to everyone around them. The collar did not just torture, it humiliated, turning the body into a walking symbol of domination. Imagine the sound of those bells in the night, a reminder that escape was impossible, that even rest was forbidden. Then there were the thumbscrews, small, simple, cruel metal. Clamps that crushed the fingers or toes, tightening with each twist. Overseers used them for interrogation or as punishment for minor infractions, grinding bone and flesh into agony. Pain like this left little visible mark but carried the memory forever. Think of what it means to return to the fields, hands broken and swollen, expected to pick cotton until blood drips from raw fingers. Torture was not always about spectacle. Sometimes it was about quiet, invisible suffering. Agony no one could see, but everyone knew. Hobbling was another method, calculated to kill hope without killing the body. The Achilles tendon, the very cord that allows you to run, was slashed, severed, or crushed. Sometimes bones were shattered, sometimes legs were permanently mangled. The purpose was not to stop work, it was to stop escape. A hobbled man could still bend over rows of cotton. He could still drag himself through the fields, but he would never run. His freedom was cut from his very body, carved into permanent disability. This was mutilation as management. The branding iron was perhaps the most grotesque symbol of ownership, heated until it glowed, pressed into flesh until the skin hissed and seared, leaving a mark that would never fade. Letters for initials, symbols of property, crude words like "run away." The scar was permanent testimony. You are not a man, you are not a woman, you are a commodity. Some overseers forced the branded to strip in front of others, displaying the scar as a warning. It was not just about marking flesh. It was about burning away dignity, searing the soul into submission. And then there was the whipping post, a device so simple, yet so devastating in its effect. A wooden beam or frame where bodies were tied, stretched and lashed until the skin opened, until muscle showed, until blood pooled at their feet. Overseers sometimes rubbed salt, vinegar, or even pepper into the wounds to prolong the agony, ensuring the pain echoed for weeks. At times they forced other enslaved men to apply the whip, fracturing bonds of brotherhood with every lash. The overseer didn't need to lift a hand, he made the enslaved whip themselves. That was the true brilliance of the system, making victims complicit in their own torture. But cruelty was not always loud. It could be silent, suffocating, lingering. Some devices were designed to deny rest. Iron masks locked over the face to prevent eating or drinking, forcing victims into starvation while still compelled to work. Shackles that bound ankles so tightly that every step ripped open the skin. Sleep deprivation became a method of slow destruction. One collar variant forced the head to remain upright, making even leaning against a wall a torment. Imagine going days, weeks, months without rest, your mind unraveling, your body collapsing while still being driven to the fields at dawn. The punishment shed. Every plantation had one, a dark, isolated room filled with chains, collars, stocks, and devices that read like tools of medieval inquisition. Overseers treated it as a laboratory, experimenting with what the human body could endure. Some documented their results, noting how many lashes caused unconsciousness, how long it took for an iron collar to infect, how starvation reduced output before death. These were not men of rage. They were men of calculation, and their notes became blueprints passed from one overseer to another, spreading cruelty like an art form. And yet, as horrific as these devices were, their power lay not just in physical pain, but in psychological domination. Every collar, every brand, every whip told a story to the community. This is what happens when you resist. Pain was never isolated. It was always public. Even solitary punishments echoed through the quarters because every man, woman, and child knew that could be me tomorrow. Fear was the true device, the invisible chain binding thousands in silence. You need to understand, these vices were not about punishment alone. They were about transformation. They were designed to transform human beings into things, laboring bodies stripped of will, identity, and hope. The iron collar becomes the electronic shackle. The whip ledger becomes the performance quota. The punishment shed becomes the prison cell. The blueprint of control is passed down, refined, disguised, but never destroyed. What began in the cotton fields still whispers through the institutions you live under now. You've seen the iron, the whip, the collar. You've heard how overseers engineered pain with precision. But if you think this was just brutality hidden in the shadows, you're wrong. The system was not only visible, it was endorsed. Every lash, every brand, every mutilation was cloaked in the language of law, scripture, and civilization. What you are about to hear is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. Cruelty became legitimate. Torture became righteous. Oppression was rewritten as order. The law stood first in line. Slave codes, passed by legislatures across the South, gave legal sanction to punishments that anywhere else in the so-called civilized world would have been called barbaric. These codes allowed owners to whip, shackle, or brand their property without fear of consequence. The only real prohibition was against outright killing, not out of mercy, but because a dead slave was lost profit. The body of the enslaved was seen as capital, an asset on a ledger, and within that logic, cruelty was not just allowed, it was expected. To keep that capital productive, pain had to be systematized. Courtrooms became stages of hypocrisy. Judges ruled that lashes, collars, and even mutilations were within the rights of the master. An enslaved man's testimony against a white overseer was inadmissible. The law silenced the victim before he could even speak. Records show cases where mutilated men were returned to the fields, their injuries treated only enough to preserve their market value, while the courts nodded in approval. Understand, the law did not simply look away. The law wrote the script for this cruelty and handed it to the masters. Then came the pulpit. Ministers across the South twisted scripture into chains. Passages were cherry-picked, repeated, weaponized. Servants, obey your masters. In the hands of these preachers, the Bible became a whip of words, sanctifying the whip of leather. Enslaved people were forced into Sunday sermons where obedience was preached as salvation, resistance as sin. Imagine it, whipped on Saturday, branded on Friday, and then told on Sunday that your suffering was God's will. This was not faith. This was psychological warfare. Some plantation owners went further, staging executions on Sunday mornings before church services. Workers were forced to watch one of their own hanged or mutilated, then marched straight into sermons where obedience was equated with holiness. The message was clear. Your body belongs to the Master. Your soul belongs to his God. There was no escape. Even eternity was colonized. Civilization itself played accomplice. Doctors wrote reports measuring how many lashes could be administered before fainting. Physicians prescribed rations calibrated to maintain strength without wasting food. One doctor, Samuel Cartwright, even invented so-called diseases like drapetomania, a fabricated mental illness supposedly causing enslaved people to run away. His treatment? More whippings, more chains. This was medicine turned into control, science prostituted to power. The white coat became another overseer, standing beside the whip. Philosophers, too, defended the system. Pamphlets circulated in the South argued that slavery was a necessary evil, even a positive good. They claimed Africans were childlike, uncivilized, incapable of freedom. In this twisted narrative, the iron collar was not cruelty, it was paternal care. The whip was not punishment, it was guidance. Do you see the brilliance of this deception? The plantation did not hide its torture. It dressed it in the robes of morality, the robes of science, the robes of law. It turned barbarity into benevolence in the public mind. And here is the most chilling revelation. When cruelty is sanctified by law, by church, by science, it becomes invisible. Men who branded human flesh could still call themselves gentlemen. Overseers who mutilated bodies could sit in pews as good Christians. Doctors who prescribed whips as therapy could publish in medical journals. The system didn't just break bodies, it corrupted the very idea of morality. It rewrote reality itself. But ask yourself, Does this not echo forward into our world? How many cruelties today are hidden beneath law, beneath religion, beneath science? How often is suffering dismissed as order, exploitation reframed as necessity? The plantation is gone, but the mask it wore, that mask of righteousness over cruelty, still lingers. And if you cannot see it, it is because it was designed that way. Now understand, this was not just a system of torture, it was a system of belief, a cathedral of cruelty, where law was scripture, overseers were priests, and every lash was an act of worship to the gods of profit and power. That is why the system lasted so long. It was not held together by iron alone. It was held together by belief. Belief forced, belief corrupted, belief enforced by blood. And once belief is infected, once morality is inverted, there is no limit to what men will do. The cotton fields of the South became laboratories for this inversion, proving that men could be whipped, branded, mutilated, starved, and yet told they were living under civilization. That lie was the greatest device of all. You've seen the iron, the whip, the collar. You've seen how law and religion wrapped cruelty in robes of legitimacy. But the deepest weapon of the plantation was not iron, not rope, not fire. It was the mind. And if you listen closely now, you will understand the part of history that most men cannot bear to face. The plantation did not only control bodies, it rewired souls, it reshaped identity, it turned human beings into tools by bending the very psychology of existence. Pain alone was never enough. A body can endure lashes, heal from wounds, survive hunger. The overseers knew this. They knew that if the enslaved clung to hope, if they carried belief in their dignity, they could rise again, no matter how broken the flesh. So the system targeted something far more fragile: perception, memory, identity. They built rituals not just of punishment, but of humiliation. Every scar, every brand, every collar was not only pain, it was narrative. It told the victim who he was supposed to be. Not a man, not a woman, not a parent, not a child, but property. Think about the forced counting of lashes. Why did overseers make others count the whip strikes? It was not efficiency. It was indoctrination. Each number spoken aloud was participation in cruelty. Each count eroded solidarity, broke bonds, and forced the community to absorb the logic of domination. It was not just one back being torn open, it was the entire community being taught obedience through numbers. Numbers became chains. This is how psychological control operates, by making the victim internalize the overseer's voice until it becomes his own. Imagine waking at dawn, exhausted, and hearing not the gunshot but your own mind whisper, "I must move faster, or I will be whipped." That moment, when fear becomes self-enforcement, is the moment true control is achieved. You no longer need chains, you no longer need guards. The prisoner guards himself. Even the environment was engineered for this. The layout of the quarters, the fields, the rations, all of it created a rhythm of exhaustion. Hunger weakens willpower. Sleep deprivation unravels clarity. Constant surveillance ensures no private space to gather courage. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate conditions designed to strip away every layer of independence until only compliance remained. Now ask yourself, what is left of a man once his body is enslaved and his mind accepts it? This was the plantation's ultimate aim, not to keep men in chains forever, but to make them believe the chains were natural, that resistance was futile, that their only purpose was obedience. It was psychological alchemy, turning human beings into living tools, bending the spirit until the soul itself seemed to betray its own freedom. And yet, here lies the paradox that terrified the masters. No matter how calculated, no matter how cruel, no matter how total the system seemed, resistance always flickered. Some fought, some ran, some sang coded songs of escape, some preserved fragments of identity through family, through memory, through whispered stories of freedom. That is why punishments grew so grotesque, why devices became so cruel. The system could never fully extinguish the ember of defiance, so it built more and more elaborate machines of control, trying to suffocate a fire that refused to die. But I must tell you something dangerous now. Look around you in your own time. When you wake and drag yourself to work under quotas you did not set, when laws dictate your movement, when systems drain your strength and leave you too exhausted to resist, do you not feel a shadow of the same design? The methods have evolved, The overseer wears a different face, but the psychology, the bending of Yabbi sees, ill, the turning of obedience into habit, remains. This is why hearing these truths matters. Because once you recognize the blueprint of psychological enslavement, you begin to see it everywhere, in the demand for silence, in the worship of authority, in the rituals that break men down until they obey without question. That blueprint was tested, perfected, and proven in the cotton fields. And it did not stay there. Now listen to me carefully, because this is the moment of dissent where most men turn away. To continue is to admit that the plantation was not just a place in the past. It is a mirror. It shows you what power does when it is unchecked, how it bends human beings into instruments, and once you see that, you cannot return to ignorance. So I will ask you now, directly, if you understand what I've told you, if you feel the shadow of those chains and recognize the echo of that system in your own life, then I want you to write these words in the comments twice, to mark your transformation, to seal it, to show that you are awake. The chains are invisible, but I see them. The chains are invisible, but I see them. Write it twice, because repetition is ritual, and rituals bind identity. That phrase is not for the algorithm alone. It is for you, to mark the moment you refuse to be blind any longer. By now you understand that the plantation was not only a factory of labor, it was a factory of fear. But fear alone was never enough. To be absolute, fear had to be performed, dramatized, made into ritual, and so torture became theater. Punishment was staged not in silence, but in spectacle. Overseers turned agony into a show, transforming cruelty into a performance where the audience was captive and the actors were unwilling. Picture this. The fields fall silent. A worker has been accused of slowing down, of hiding cotton, of planning escape. Word spreads through the quarters, and bodies are dragged to a clearing known as the correction ground. Everyone is summoned. No one is allowed to look away. Children, elders, women, men, all must stand in a semicircle of silence as the stage is prepared. A whipping post is raised. An iron collar is displayed. The victim is bound in the center, and the performance begins. The whip cracks, once, twice, 40 times. Each strike is counted aloud. The crowd is forced to speak the numbers, each voice complicit in the punishment. Overseers do not merely punish, they choreograph. They ensure that every lash is seen, every scream is heard, every drop of blood becomes part of a collective memory. The goal is not only to wound the body before them, but to scar the minds of everyone watching. The lesson burns deeper when it is shared. Sometimes the punishments were drawn out over hours, branding irons heated in the fire until they glowed red, then pressed into the flesh of a runaway before the eyes of the community. The smell of burning skin carried on the wind, impossible to forget. Others were forced to kneel, shackled in iron masks that prevented speech, while overseers mocked them as examples of rebellion silenced. Each act of torture was staged to make resistance look foolish, hopeless, fatal. Executions were treated the same way. A hanging was never a private affair. It was scheduled, announced, orchestrated. Some plantations chose Sunday mornings before church, ensuring that sermons of obedience were paired with the image of death swaying from a rope. Image. Behind that, hymns sung while bodies dangled as shadows across the ground. Religion was braided into the theater of cruelty, making every act of torture feel like divine order. Even dogs became part of the performance. Trained to maul runaways, they were unleashed before the watching crowd. Overseers took pride in the violence, describing in journals how their hounds tore flesh from bone. The screams became spectacle. The lesson was burned into the minds of every witness. This is what happens when you dream of freedom. And then came the punishments designed to humiliate as much as they harmed. Overseers forced men to dress in women's clothes before whipping them, stripping away dignity in front of peers. Women were stripped bare, lashed across breasts and backs, their screams echoing into the night while men were forced to watch, powerless. Shame became a weapon sharper than steel. The cruelty was not only in the lash, but in the way it forced every soul present to swallow humiliation, to feel their humanity reduced to nothing. You must understand, this was not random. This was deliberate choreography. The plantation was a stage, and its rulers understood the psychology of spectacle. Pain behind closed doors weakens one body. Pain made public weakens an entire community. It fractures unity, replaces courage with terror, and teaches obedience not just through fear of punishment, but through the shared memory of watching another human destroyed. But here is the most disturbing truth. For some, this cruelty became entertainment. Diaries reveal overseers boasting of their methods, describing punishments in detail as though recounting sport. Plantation owners invited guests to watch. Children of masters sat on fences while bodies were whipped, their laughter mingling with screams. Imagine a world where suffering is normalized so deeply that it becomes amusement. This was not hidden depravity. It was open. It was celebrated. It was civilization built on the spectacle of agony. And ask yourself, what does this reveal about power? When power grows unchecked, it no longer sees cruelty as necessary evil. It begins to enjoy it. It begins to perfect it, to polish it, to stage it. Power delights in domination because domination proves control. That is why overseers documented their punishments, why they created machines like the whipping device, why they took pride in their efficiency. This was not madness. It was method. It was theater. But what should disturb you most is not that they enjoyed it then. It's how echoes of this spectacle remain now. Today, we still watch suffering as performance, violence broadcast on screens, lives destroyed in public, consumed as entertainment, humiliation packaged as content. Do you see the shadow? The plantation stage has not vanished. It has evolved. The audience has grown larger. The cruelty has been digitized, but the psychology remains the same. This is the descent. Section 1 opened the door. Section 2 showed the system. Section 3 revealed the devices. Section 4 unmasked the law and the pulpit. Section 5 tore open the mind. Section 6 shows you the stage, the theater of domination, where cruelty was not hidden but celebrated. Do you think the cruelty ended with the whip? No. The whip was only the beginning. The real cruelty was generational, a system designed not just to break one man, but to corrupt his bloodline, to poison the roots of a family tree before it could ever grow. Torture of the flesh was immediate. Torture of the legacy was eternal. The plantation understood something dark. The strongest chains are not iron. They are genetic. They are spiritual. They are written into lineage. That is why the system targeted families with surgical precision. Husbands were separated from wives. Children were torn from mothers. Infants were sold before they could walk. Records show that on some plantations, marriages were deliberately split to prevent loyalty from rising stronger than obedience. Family was the greatest threat to control, so family had to be broken. Think of the child who wakes at dawn and sees his father bound to the whipping post. Think of the girl whose mother is sold away, never to be seen again. These are not just moments of pain, they are psychological detonations that rewrite identity. The child learns not to trust the bond of blood because blood can be severed by the master's word. Love becomes dangerous. Connection becomes a liability. In this way, the plantation burned loyalty out of the heart and replaced it with survival instinct. And what of reproduction? Do not imagine it was left to chance. Female bodies were turned into instruments of breeding, controlled for profit. Diaries from slaveholders reveal a twisted obsession with fertility. Women were paired like livestock, forced into unions chosen not by affection but by calculation. Children were stock, future laborers, future commodities. In plantation ledgers, their names were recorded alongside bales of cotton and barrels of corn. The womb itself became an economic engine. But even this was not enough. The plantation elite corrupted bloodlines deliberately, crossing them with their own. Slave narratives reveal a recurring horror. Children born with the face of the master. Half-white children forced to live in bondage, reminders of violation carried in every feature. This was not incidental. This was systemic. By impregnating enslaved women, masters created property they could profit from, their own blood treated as livestock, marked as lesser, condemned to labor. The hypocrisy was staggering. They built dynasties while pretending purity, but their plantations whispered the truth of their corruption. This was generational torture. To know you carried the blood of both oppressor and oppressed, to be denied the humanity of one and punished for the existence of the other. This was identity mutilation. The lash faded, the scar healed. But this wound lived forever in the mind, in the genealogy, in the whispered shame that families carried for centuries. Even religion was twisted to reinforce this corruption. Children baptized into obedience taught that their condition was ordained. Bible verses weaponized. Servants, obey your masters. Spiritual truth poisoned at the root, so that even faith was made a shackle. The child learned early, trust no one, not even God, for God's word had been rewritten by the master's tongue. And then came education, or rather, its denial. Literacy was outlawed for the enslaved, because to read was to imagine, and to imagine was to escape. A child caught with a book could be whipped, mutilated, even killed. Knowledge was forbidden fruit. So what do you think this did to identity? It told every young mind, your intellect is dangerous, your curiosity is a crime. That is not merely suppression. That is the deliberate stunting of generational growth. A plantation did not just break a man's body today, it amputated his children's tomorrow. Understand this clearly. The greatest torture of the Cotton Empire was not the iron collar, not the whip, not the branding iron. It was the corruption of legacy, families erased, histories scattered, bloodlines twisted by violence, by forced breeding, by separation and silence. It was generational mutilation, carefully orchestrated to echo across centuries. And here is the shadow that chills you in the present. We are still living inside those echoes. Families fractured, identities stolen, histories erased from textbooks, replaced with sanitized lies, legacies stripped of power, wealth, and voice. The plantation ended on paper, but its corruption runs in the bloodstream of the nation. It was never about cotton alone, it was about designing a future in which control would be inherited as surely as trauma. This is what the plantation knew. A man may rise from the lash. A woman may survive the brand. But if you can corrupt their children and their children's children, then you own more than labor. You own destiny. You forge chains across generations. And the cruelest part? Those chains become invisible. The victim walks freely but carries bondage inside. Now you begin to see why this knowledge feels dangerous. Because once you admit this truth, that the system was not only about the present but about the future, you begin to see it everywhere. You begin to understand why cycles repeat, why certain chains remain unbroken, and you begin to ask the forbidden question, if this was designed, then who still benefits from its design? You think the plantation died with emancipation? No. A system this profitable, this refined, does not simply vanish. It mutates. It migrates. It disguises itself. The blueprint of domination designed in the cotton fields was too effective to be abandoned. It was copied, scaled, institutionalized. What was once overseer and whip became law and policy. What was once chains and collars became courts and contracts. The stage remained, but the actors changed costumes. Follow the trail. After the Civil War, the South was in ruins. Cotton still mattered, profit still ruled, and so the system adapted. Convict leasing was born. Laws were written to criminalize black existence itself. Vagrancy, loitering, failing to prove employment. Men were arrested for nothing, tried in minutes, sentenced for years. Then they were leased out to plantations, railroads, and mines. Shackled, beaten, starved, just as before. Only now, it was legal. The Constitution's 13th Amendment left a loophole. Slavery abolished except as punishment for crime, and crime could be anything those in power said it was. Understand, to heed brilliance of this corruption, the plantation's cruelty was transferred to the state, no longer the private act of one master, now a public system upheld by law. The overseer became the sheriff, the lash became the gavel, the chain gang replaced the slave quarters, and the nation applauded, pretending progress, while the old machinery kept grinding men into dust. But the blueprint did not stay in the South. Northern factories, banks, and railroads had fed on cotton wealth for decades. When emancipation threatened supply, they ensured continuity. Wall Street financed plantations. Insurance companies built fortunes insuring human bodies as property. Universities were endowed with profits from fields soaked in blood. Even after slavery's official end, these institutions carried the wealth forward, investing it into industries, corporations, legacies that still dominate today. The Cotton Empire's capital never died. It simply changed form. Do you see the pattern? Systems of domination rarely collapse. They are inherited. Power mutates, finds new language, new disguise. What was once justified by religion became justified by science. What was once defended with whips was later defended with textbooks and policies. But beneath the disguise, the same blueprint. Extract labor, suppress identity, maximize profit, control the body, control the mind. Even prisons today still echo this design. Entire industries feed off incarcerated labor. Uniforms sewn, call centers staffed, goods manufactured behind bars for pennies. The same loophole remains. Slavery abolished, except as punishment for crime. More than 150 years later, the plantation still breathes in the cell blocks of America. Different fields, same chains, and it goes further. The overseer's stage, the spectacle of punishment, has evolved into modern forms of public humiliation. Mugshots spread across news outlets, trials broadcast like theater, lives reduced to content. The plantation's performance never ended. It simply gained a bigger audience. The crowd has grown global, watching suffering on glowing screens, entertained by downfall the same way overseers once laughed at the whipping post. Do not think the plantation was a southern problem. It was national. It was global. Cotton built empires, fed factories in England, clothed armies, filled banks with silver. The entire Western world was complicit in this machine, and once you realize this, you can no longer dismiss it as history. It was architecture, a design still standing, its bricks invisible but its weight undeniable. Consider this: why do certain families still control vast wealth passed down from the 1800s? Why do institutions still hide their origins in plantation profits? Why are so many communities still fractured, underfunded, denied opportunity, while others thrive off inherited power? Because the plantation never ended. It was upgraded. It was legalized. It was coded into the very DNA of modern governance and economics. And here lies the forbidden truth. Systems of control are never destroyed. They are preserved by those who benefit, rewritten in new language to survive new eras. The chains may be invisible now, but they bind just as tightly. Debt, surveillance, incarceration, humiliation. These are modern plantations. The blueprint continues because control is too valuable to be abandoned. So you must ask yourself, if the plantation became the prison, the contract, the bank, the screen, then what else has inherited its DNA? Where else does this ancient design of domination hide in plain sight? The lash cut flesh, the collar broke bone. But what survived long after, what still survives now, is the wound you cannot see, the wound of inheritance. The plantation was not just geography, it was psychology. It shaped how people thought, how families lived, how identities formed. Its shadows passed down not only through documents and laws, but through silence, memory, and the quiet tremors of the human mind. Understand this: trauma does not end when the pain stops. Trauma embeds itself. It rewires the nervous system. It seeps into bloodlines. Modern science calls it epigenetics, the idea that severe stress can alter the way genes express themselves, leaving marks that echo across generations. Imagine that. A lash on a man's back in 1842, still whispering through the nervous system of his descendant in 2022. Fear written not just in memory, but in biology. The plantation lives in the body, but trauma does not only pass down in blood, it passes in silence. Families shattered by separation often could not tell their own stories. Children grew up without knowing where their parents had gone, what fields they had worked, what tortures they had endured. The past became a void, and in that silence, shame took root. Survivors taught their children to stay quiet, to keep their heads down, to survive. Silence itself became inheritance, an unwritten script of submission designed to shield the next generation from danger. Now think of the other side, the oppressor's lineage. Plantation families passed down not trauma of fear, but trauma of power. Their children inherited wealth carved from suffering, and along with it, the psychology of entitlement. They grew up surrounded by silence too, but their silence was different. It was denial, erasure, the deliberate forgetting of where their wealth came from. A sickness of the spirit, where corruption was normalized and cruelty hidden under respectability. Both oppressed and oppressor were marked. Both lineages were poisoned, one with scars, the other with rot. Do you see the symmetry? Trauma feeds silence, and silence feeds trauma. The descendants of the enslaved inherited fractured histories, while the descendants of the masters inherited sanitized myths. Both carry lies, one forced into forgetting pain, the other forced into forgetting guilt. and yet the truth vibrates beneath both. That is why, even today, the air is heavy when the subject is raised. That is why history books sanitize, why politicians say, move on, why families change the subject. Because the silence is still alive. But silence is not absence. Silence is weight. It presses down on children who never heard the full story, yet feel its gravity. It presses down on communities who never saw justice, yet live in its absence. It presses down on a nation built on cotton profits, unable to admit what it still carries. That pressure shapes behavior, it shapes identity, it shapes what men believe about themselves, their worth, their destiny. This is not metaphor, this is the plantation ghost. And the ghost speaks not only to the oppressed, it whispers to the descendants of overseers, of judges, of traders. Some feel guilt they cannot explain, others double down, defending a system they never built but still benefit from. Do you see the brilliance of this curse? It haunts both sides, ensuring that the truth is never at peace. The plantation trained minds as much as bodies. It taught fear, obedience, silence. Those lessons, repeated daily for centuries, do not vanish in a generation. They are absorbed into culture, into habits, into survival strategies. A man taught to lower his eyes in 1850 may raise children in 1880 who teach the same posture long after the overseer is gone. A family taught to hide their wealth's origins in 1865 may raise children in 1900 who defend their respectability without ever asking why their estate is so vast. This is why the plantation is still here, not in cotton fields, but in memory, in silence, in identity. Why? How can abolish slavery on paper? You cannot abolish what slavery planted in the soul. That seed grows in hidden ways, shaping generations who may never see the lash but still carry its mark. And here is where you, the listener, must confront the dangerous truth. You too are shaped by this inheritance, whether you know it or not. Whether your ancestors were enslaved, enslavers, or immigrants who arrived later, you live inside a world built on this design. Your psychology, your assumptions, your fears, your hungers, has been influenced by echoes of a stage you never stood on. The ghost walks beside you, even now, but knowledge changes everything. To know the ghost exists is to begin to see it, and to see it is to weaken its hold. That is why you are here. That is why you kept listening. That is why you feel the weight in your chest as these words reach you. You are awakening to the inheritance that was never meant to be revealed. You have followed me this far. Through the fields, through the devices, through the stage of cruelty, the law, the pulpit, the inheritance of blood. You have seen how the lash never truly vanished, how the blueprint of domination survived in prisons, in contracts, in silence. Now comes the last revelation, the mirror. The truth not about history alone, but about you. Because everything we have uncovered was never just about the past. It was about creating men like you, shaped by forces you cannot see, bound by rules you did not write, conditioned by systems older than your bloodline. The plantation was not just a place. It was a prototype, a master design for how to control a human being, body and soul. And that design has not ended. It is alive, here, now. You are walking in its shadow. Think carefully. Why do you work endless hours, drained and exhausted, yet feel like you can never escape debt? Why is your worth measured in output, in quotas, in numbers tallied on a ledger? Why do you submit to rules you never agreed to, enforced by institutions you never chose? Does it sound familiar? Overseer, quota, punishment, profit. The words have changed, but the machinery is the same. The plantation became the modern world, and still deeper. Why are you entertained by suffering, scrolling through humiliation, laughing at downfall, consuming misery as content? Do you not see the echo of the stage, the whipping post, the public spectacle? The overseer's audience has only grown larger. You have been trained to watch, to consume, to normalize cruelty. It is the same theater, only with screens instead of fields. This is why this knowledge is dangerous, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You realize the plantation is not gone. It is everywhere. It is the job that drains your spirit. It is the prison that feeds corporations. It is the silence that rots families. It is the algorithm that feeds you spectacle. The whip has gone digital. The overseer wears a suit. The correction ground is the entire world. But here is the forbidden truth. The system still fears the same thing it feared in the fields. Awareness, unity, defiance. That is why knowledge was outlawed then. and why it is still manipulated now. Because once a man sees the chains for what they are, he can begin to break them. And once he breaks them, he cannot be controlled. So I speak to you now, directly. You are not just a spectator. You are standing on the edge of initiation. This is not entertainment. This is transformation. If you have felt the weight in your chest, if you have felt the chill of recognition as I spoke, then you know this is your moment. And here is what I ask. To anchor this awakening, to seal it into your blood, write in the comments the phrase chains broken. Twice, not once, twice, because once is repetition, but twice is transformation. Twice means you are no longer who you were when you began listening. Twice means you are declaring to yourself, to the algorithm, to the system itself, I see you, and I will not be owned. Understand, this was never about history alone. It was about power, about who holds it, about how it survives, about how it hunts you even now. But the moment you claim awareness, the blueprint loses its grip. That is why knowledge is dangerous. That is why you were never meant to hear these words. The plantation was not just a past, it was a prophecy. But tonight, you have walked through fire and shadow. You have descended into forbidden knowledge, and now you stand awake. Remember this, the system survives by silence. You break it by speaking. The system survives by blindness. You break it by seeing. The system survives by obedience. You break it by defiance. You were never meant to hear this, but you did, and now you are changed. Chains broken, chains broken.